In the late 1960s, the Soviet Union worked with Italy's Fiat to build a vast new car factory in Togliatti, the plant that would later become known around the world as Lada. Its main purpose was to sharply increase production of modern passenger cars and at least partially satisfy the enormous domestic market. Exports also played an important role by bringing the Soviet Union much-needed foreign currency. This was also the era of the Cold War and the arms race, and the Soviet defense establishment held enormous influence. It could draw almost any major industrial enterprise into its projects, and the new factory, with modern equipment, its own engineering center, and vast production capacity, soon attracted the attention of the Ministry of Defense. It is hard to say how pleased the factory was about this. Refusing such a customer was practically impossible, and in the early 1970s, the engineering department was ordered to develop a light, four-wheel drive command vehicle for company-level officers. Development of the future Neva was already well underway, so the obvious solution seemed to be creating one basic off-road vehicle and then splitting it into two branches, one civilian and one military, while keeping as many shared components as possible. This would save a great deal of time and resources, while simplifying production, servicing, and spare parts supply. The approach seemed perfectly logical. There was only one important complication. The military needed a vehicle capable of crossing water obstacles under its own power. In other words, an amphibious vehicle. The requirement for amphibious capability was not simply the whim of a few military officers. Soviet doctrine called for a rapid advance across the European theater, where water obstacles could not be allowed to hold up the troops for long. This is why much of the Soviet Union's light armored equipment was designed to float and cross rivers and canals directly from the march. The same capability was required from the new command vehicle. By early 1973, Lada engineers and military specialists had defined the main requirements for the future amphibious vehicle: the maximum width of a water obstacle it had to cross, its speed on water, the permitted wave height, and the maximum current it could handle. The need for easy field repairs had an immediate effect on the design. The body panels were made as flat as possible, with very few complex curves. The amphibian was to use components from the future Neva. The gearbox and transfer case were placed inside the sealed body, while the axles and suspension components remained outside. Every point where parts of the transmission and running gear passed through the body had to be carefully sealed. Propellers were rejected almost immediately. The vehicle was expected to move through the water using only the rotation of its wheels. This was a reasonable solution for a machine that would spend most of its time driving rather than swimming. The first two prototypes were completed in 1976. One was painted yellow, while the other was green, though not in a military shade. In open documentation, the project was described as a vehicle for fishermen and hunters. Completely hiding such a development at a large civilian factory, where dozens and possibly hundreds of people could see it, was almost impossible. The project was therefore not so much concealed as disguised as a civilian special purpose vehicle. The car officially received the designation Lada 2122, following the Neva, which carried the designation Lada 2121. The name Reka, meaning river, was added later, although it had originally been the codename for the entire military project. Testing revealed serious problems almost immediately. The special tires developed for the Reka were larger than those used on the Neva and placed heavy loads on the running gear, quickly wearing out individual components. Visibility was also worse than required, while water tests showed that the body suffered from numerous leaks. These faults could still be corrected through further development. The much more serious problem was cooling. The radiator did not receive enough airflow, causing the engine to overheat quickly. Even after several modifications, the cooling system continued to operate at its limit. The situation was even worse for the transmission components mounted inside the sealed body. With little airflow and almost no cooling, the gearbox, transfer case, and front differential overheated rapidly, sharply reducing their service life and creating a serious risk of failure. The Neva components also lacked enough strength for a vehicle of this type. Even if all these problems had been solved, one more obstacle remained, and it had been known since the early stages of the project. On Lada's normal production line, the powertrain was installed from below. The amphibian needed a closed and fully sealed floor, which made it impossible to install the components in the same way. Producing the Lada 2122 would therefore have required a major change to the manufacturing process and a separate assembly section that could not be fully used for other models. Off-road testing showed that the amphibian was roughly equal to the Neva in cross-country ability, which was more than sufficient for a vehicle of this type. From the outside, it did not look like a vehicle capable of floating at all. The interior followed the customer's requirements and the traditions of off-road vehicles of the period. It was made as simple and even primitive as possible. There was no upholstery, and the dashboard was made entirely of metal. The cabin was about as sophisticated as an entrenching shovel. The shovel itself, incidentally, was also supposed to be part of the vehicle's standard equipment. While developing the second series of prototypes, the engineers tried to solve the transmission overheating problem by installing an oil cooler. That idea had to be abandoned, and they turned to a more traditional solution by moving the front differential outside the sealed body. A large air intake appeared at the front to improve airflow to the radiator. The body, floor, and side panels were extensively redesigned for the second series. The main problem still remained. Cooling was not effective enough, and the overloaded components still had an unacceptably short service life. It became clear that there was no point endlessly treating the old design with isolated modifications. The third series of the Reka, introduced in 1982, was therefore radically different from its predecessors. The body was designed from scratch. It became lighter and more compact, with dimensions close to those of a standard Neva. The large special wheels were replaced with regular Neva wheels, while the previous 1.6-liter engine gave way to a smaller 1.3-liter unit. The decision looked strange at first. The military vehicle had been made smaller and less powerful. Earlier versions had simply proved too heavy for the Neva components. Reducing the engine capacity, wheel size, overall dimensions, and payload was intended to ease the load on the transmission and reduce heat buildup. Its off-road and amphibious abilities were barely affected. The vehicle became weaker on paper, but much closer to something that could realistically be put into production. The year was already 1982. Almost 10 years had passed since development began, yet the amphibian was still an experimental vehicle that had not yet proved its suitability for military service. The Reka project was not among the Ministry of Defense's highest priorities. The Army's main requirement for light command vehicles was already covered by UAZ models. They could not float, but the military was not prepared to launch an entirely new vehicle at any cost for that feature alone. Development continued nonetheless. The fourth series, known as Series 400, appeared in 1983. The fifth series, Series 500, followed in 1985 and was already regarded as the pre-production version. 10 of these vehicles were built. Some remained at the factory, while the rest were sent for extended testing, including trials with military units. The trials were largely successful, and the vehicle could be considered fully ready for series production. The final decision still belonged to the Ministry of Defense as the main customer. The vehicle made a good impression when it was shown to the Minister of Defense. His attitude changed noticeably when Lada's general director revealed how much money would be needed to put the amphibian into production. Setting up annual production of around 500 vehicles required 6 million rubles. In modern terms, that would be roughly $24 million, although any such comparison with the Soviet planned economy is necessarily approximate. The amount was not enormous by the standards of the defense budget, but it would fund only a very small series of specialized vehicles. Despite its high level of parts sharing with the Neva, the amphibian could not be assembled on the same production line. It required separate tooling, equipment, and its own assembly section. The Ministry of Defense was prepared to order completed vehicles, but it refused to fund the preparation of production. Lada was also unwilling to pay for the launch of a low-volume military model from its own budget, especially when the factory was already fully occupied with civilian car production. The wider situation in both the Soviet Union and the world was also changing. The project had already lasted more than 10 years, and the second half of the 1980s brought cuts in defense spending, industrial conversion, and a reassessment of military priorities. A light amphibious command vehicle was no longer considered important enough to justify creating a separate production facility. The project was canceled in 1988. It is difficult to blame the engineers for the Reka's inglorious ending. They were given an extremely demanding task, and after more than 10 years of work, they finally created a vehicle that could drive, float, and pass its trials. The real problem was elsewhere. As long as the project only required new prototypes, everyone seemed to support it. But when the time came to fund production, it suddenly became something nobody wanted to pay for. Only a few late-series Reka vehicles have survived to the present day, and the machine remains one of the most unusual military projects in Lada's history.